We've got a pretty good lineup here today, and we're not going to try and take all 2 hours of your time listening to speakers because there's a lot of folks here. We want to talk with one another. One thing I would like to say before we get too far into the program, before the end of today is over, we want to leave a message for the legislature. And what we'd like to do is everyone who's here and is so willing to gather on the steps here at the State House. And we're going to take a picture of everyone who's here. We'll have the long guns in front. But what we want to do is send a message to the legislature and to the media and say, you know what? You might not have been here, but we were. And we don't forget. So pay attention. So we'll do that maybe 2/3 of the way through the program. And as the sort of organizer and MC, I'm going to take the privilege of going first, if you don't mind. And I'd like to open with a statement, and I want you to listen carefully. Civilian firearms ownership created this republic. Let me say that again. Civilian firearm ownership created this republic. No one else. If we look back to our history, we go back as early as 1763, when sort of the troubles really began here in the colonies. The British government had just come off a victory, but a financially crushing victory in the French and Indian Wars, and decided that one way to maybe recoup some of their losses is to tax the new colonies who were beginning to prosper. We had manufacturing, we had shipbuilding, we had agricultural resources. So why not tax these people? Let them help pay for these wars. And interestingly enough, the first round of civil disobedience that followed the imposition of the early taxes in 1763 got the attention of the British government, because a lot of the disobedience dealt with, we're not going to buy your stuff. Ship it over here, we're not going to buy it. How are you going to pay for your war? So one by one they began to repeal some of these taxes, but in exchange, because they saw this bubbling up of resistance, they began sending troops, having them quartered in towns. They began sending battalions and British soldiers here to kind of keep an eye on us. By the time 1770 came around, tensions truly boiled over, and it resulted in the Boston Massacre. Innocent civilians, some military died. Nobody really understands what started it. But out of that came John Adams saying, you know, facts are stubborn things, and we need to remember that facts are stubborn things. 3 years later, after the Boston Massacre, and contrary to popular opinion, a bunch of guys dressed up like Native Americans and threw some tea into a harbor. And they did this not because taxes were increased, but the truth of the matter was the British government, in a last attempt to prop up the East India Company, its equivalent of the military-industrial complex, nationalized the tea business. No longer would colonials be allowed to buy tea at wholesale and resell to their own customers. Only a very select few that were approved by the British Crown were allowed to do this. So the colonists said, you know what, that just doesn't seem quite fair, so we're not going to go along with it. Now, less than a year later, Parliament says, gee, these people are getting a little bit out of hand, and they pass a parliamentary act that bans, quote, the exportation of gunpowder or any sort of arms or ammunition to the American colonies. That very same year, a fellow named Lord Dartmouth, who was the equivalent of the ambassador, a British ambassador and secretary to the American states, suggested to Thomas Gage, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Province, that he should, quote, disarm the inhabitants of Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Now, Boston's not that far away from here, and we were one of those colonies that they were seeking to disarm. But 600 miles away from Boston, other colonies were listening and paying attention. And in fact, on March 23rd, 1775, Patrick Henry was addressing the House of Burgesses in Virginia. And he says to them, he says, "I ask you, sir, what means this martial array, if not to force us to submission? Has Great Britain any enemy in this quarter of the world that would call for this accumulation of armies and navies? No, sir, she has none. Make no mistake, they are meant for us, and we must fight. An appeal to arms and to the God of hosts is all that is left to us. We must fight. But when they say we're weak, that we cannot possibly overcome such a force as the British government. But when will we be stronger? Will it be next week, next month, next year? Or will it be when we are totally disarmed and there's a British guard stationed in every house? The battle, sir, is not to the strong alone, but to the vigilant, the active, and the brave. 3 weeks later, at Lexington and Concord, the war begins in earnest. A little more than a month later, British generals arrive with orders again from this same Lord Dartmouth saying that all cannon, small arms, and other military stores of every kind that may be either in any public magazine or secretly collected together for the purpose of aiding rebellions should also be seized and secured, and that the persons of all such who have committed this treason shall be arrested and imprisoned. 3 weeks later, the same Thomas Gage, governor of the Massachusetts Bay Province, makes a proclamation to the citizens of Boston. He says, "Whereas the infatuated multitudes who have long suffered themselves to be conducted by certain well-known incendiaries and traitors, and have at length proceeded to avowed rebellion, it remains for those of us who are entrusted with supreme rule, to prove that they do not bear the sword in vain. A number of armed persons, the amount of many thousands on the 19th, behind walls, behind lurking holes, attacked a detachment of British soldiers who, unprepared for vengeance and willing to decline it, made use of their arms only in their defense. Since that period, the rebels, deriving confidence from impunity, have added insult to outrage. And now I avail myself of the last effort within the bounds of my duty to spare the effusion of blood, and do hereby in His Majesty's name tell all to lay down their arms and return to the duties of peaceable subjects." Peaceable subjects, excepting, of course, only Sam Adams and John Hancock. And to that end, that no person within this proffered mercy may plead ignorance of the consequence of refusing it, I proclaim that all persons, their adherents, associates, abettors, all and every person and persons of what class, denomination, or description whatsoever, who have appeared in arms and shall not lay down those arms, to be rebels and traitors, and to be traitors. And whereas for the continuation of this present unnatural rebellion, I declare the law martial for as long as necessary during these unhappy, uncertain times. A few months later, July 6, 1775, in Philadelphia, the representatives of the United Colleges of the Americas publish a document. And I'm summarizing this, but I'm taking some direct quotes. It says, "Our cause is just, our union is perfect, our internal resources are great. We gratefully acknowledge that His providence would not permit us to be called upon in this severe controversy unless we had grown up to our present strength and possessed of the means to defend ourselves. With hearts fortified, we most solemnly before God declare that the arms We have been compelled by our enemies to assume we will, in defiance of every hazard, with unabating firmness and perseverance, employ for the preservation of our liberties, being with one mind resolved to die free men rather than live slaves. We fight not for glory, but we are an unremarkable people who have been attacked by unprovoked enemies without any imputation or suspicion of offense. They boast of their privileges and their civilization, and yet proffer no milder conditions to us than servitude or death. And they close saying, in our own native land, in defense of the freedom that is our birthright, for the protection of our property, acquired solely by the honest industry of our forefathers and ourselves, against violence actually offered, we have taken up arms. We shall lay them down when hostilities cease, on the part of the aggressors, and all danger of their being renewed have passed, and not before.
Oh, yeah.
So you think about this. These guys are taking on the British government after years of pleading, after years of saying, treat us fairly, treat us as equals, and it doesn't happen. So 8 years pass after this declaration for the taking up of arms. 2 contemporary presidential terms. 8 years pass before the British are defeated and the war ends. Another 6 years pass after that. A contemporary Senate term go by before the Bill of Rights is even written, and 2 more years pass before it's ratified. In all, 28 years. 28 years, a generation passes between the first encroachment on the Americans to the ratification of the federal Constitution. A whole generation. And when you think about a generation that only has the attention span of 140 characters, how can we possibly teach them what they're about to lose? And that's why we're here today. In our own native land, in defense of the freedom that is our birthright, we've taken up arms. We're not going to lay them down. The Bill of Rights didn't give me the right to defend myself. God gave me that right.
Yeah.
So when people tell you the Second Amendment is about hunting or it's about this or that, no, it's not. It's about preserving our liberty. It's about protecting our families and our property. Make no mistake. So thank you for your forbearance.
Croc TV.